remember the exact weight of the silence the night I realized Daniel had stopped being mine. We had been in love, or at least we had loved the idea of each other. We drank the same bitter coffee at 3 in the morning, laughed at the same dry jokes, and learned the same small rituals. How he liked his left sock, the way his brow furrowed when he was trying to remember a name. He taught me to appreciate fragile things, the tempo of a good song, the exact bend of a reed that made a saxophone sing. I taught him to cook an egg without burning it. We accumulated small trusts like stamps in a passport. None of it felt fragile then. None of it foreshadowed the loosened edges. His infidelity didn't arrive with fanfare or dramatic confrontation. It arrived like a leaking faucet, one small drip, then another, until the room was drowned. I found the messages in his phone cache. Curt, electric exchanges with someone named Mara. They were not poetic, not the feverish dregs of a desperate affair. They were ordinary. Mundane. Worse, unapologetically intimate in that way modern intimacy wears like sweat. Immediate, casual, disposable. I remember how my hands went cold as I scrolled, how my thumb stopped its habitual scroll at a photo of the two of them at a cafe I knew he hadn't gone to with me. The camera angle, the way Mara's hair fell across her cheek, the laugh on Daniel's face. Like a different frequency of the same happiness we used to make together. I should have spoken then. I should have asked. I should have bargained. But what I felt first was not anger. It was a peculiar bone-deep quiet, the kind that presses its palms to your ears and tells you to listen to the sound of yourself thinking. What followed people would later call fury. But fury is crude. What I felt was a sharp, patient focus, as if a lens inside me had narrowed and begun to examine every corner of the life we had built. It examined receipts, calendar entries, the small lenders of our privacy, emails, old messages, bookmarked flights. It noticed the lie that a man who said, "I love you," meant, "I love you exclusively." It noticed the complacency in our routines, how we had folded into each other like a pair of fingers in gloves, warm and unthinking. The first thing I did was gather information. My revenge, I decided, would not be moments of ragged hysteria or cheap spectacle. It would be thorough. It would be precise. I wanted my victory to hurt in ways that mattered. Psychological, social, irrevocable. I began with the small archaeology of a life. I learned Mara's schedule from Daniel's calendar. Pilates Tuesdays, a late shift at the boutique, brunch with work friends on Sundays. I found her social media, photos curated, a smile that asked for validation, a feed that chronicled an identity as carefully assembled as ours. I learned her favorite coffee, oat latte at 7:30 a.m., and the cafe she favored when the boutique closed early. Seeing her in those pictures made me sick with a cold, animal recognition. She was a woman who wanted to be seen. She wanted to be someone's trophy of modern softness. She wanted to be Daniel's secret. I learned people too. The co-workers, the friends who flitted in and out like moths. I listened to Daniel speak about his job, the client meetings, the promotions he had quietly promised himself. He loved control, in spreadsheets, in timetables, in the small territorialities of a relationship. That made him predictable. Predictability is a weapon if you know how to aim it. I thought about confronting him. I thought about heartbreak as catharsis. How the rain feels when you first let yourself cry. But I've learned, late and hard, that heartbreak can be public and pathetic. I didn't want to be the version of myself that sobbed in apartments past midnight like a cinematic trope. I wanted to be the version who took what was his and dismantled the foundations he'd thought unshakable. So I planned. Planning was the comfort I had. Lists, spreadsheets, contingencies. I cataloged his routines, gym at 6 a.m. on Mondays and Wednesdays, calls with clients after 9 p.m., his mother's birthday always celebrated in half-truths. I set up innocuous things, a vintage camera on eBay that I used to buy physical photos, an anonymous email for a fake brand collaboration, a prop profile that allowed me to peer into other people's lives without being observed. There is a thrill in pretending to be someone else and seeing how the world responds. It is a mild godlike feeling, and it steadied my hand. Revenge is a social craft as much as an emotional one. People responded exactly as they'd always responded to Daniel. He was accomplished, flattering, relied upon. He had built a life where his reputation softened his edges. He liked his image curated. It was easy to fray the thread by pulling at the right point. I began by undermining his competence. I called a few clients, playing the role of a meticulous assistant, and subtly suggested delays in deliverables that didn't exist. I planted doubts, a misfiled document here, a client concern there. It was petty, necessary. People are brittle when they fear they might lose what they value. I sent emails from a fake journalist asking for a comment about a minor ethical gray area his company had flirted with. I made sure the emails were professional, plausible, non-accusatory. Only invitations for scrutiny. Meanwhile, I controlled his social feedback more intimately. I watched the digital breadcrumb trail between him and Mara and saved everything. It gave me leverage that wasn't just moral but factual. If I wanted to break him, I needed evidence that could tear his social thread as well as his private one. The last thing I wanted was for him to wriggle free with apologies and performative remorse. I wanted to remove the possibility of a convenient resurrection. People underestimate the potency of precisely timed humiliation. It is not the public shame that kills. It's the slow evaporation of trust, the multiplication of doubt in places he thought solid. So I set to work seeding doubt among his friends and colleagues. I didn't shout his sins from rooftops. I asked questions that suggested possibilities. Is Daniel really as committed as he seems? I would ask a mutual friend at a dinner, casually, letting the question hang like a scent. People fill silences with their own fears. In a week, rumors that he'd been less than faithful were not whispered. They were treated as probable. The social infrastructure that had propped him up, friends, colleagues, clients, grew hairline cracks. But rumor alone is ephemeral. You need anchor points, facts that can be revisited. So I used the evidence, the messages, the photos, the receipts, and turned them into stories. I didn't publish them. I weaponized them in a way that could not be denounced with a single "no, you're wrong." I sent them selectively. An anonymous package to a client with a note written in Daniel's handwriting that suggested betrayal of client confidentiality. A photograph of Daniel and Mara to his sister, posed with a caption meant to look like he'd written it in a private moment. The sister, who had always taken his side like a natural reflex, called me in fury. Before long she became a fracture that pulled his family into the breaking circle. There's a particular cruelty in watching someone realize that the scaffolding of their life is not made of steel but of other people's perceptions. Daniel called me, voice tight and pleading, that night after his sister had confronted him. He said he loved me. He said he'd made a mistake. He promised. Oh, the promises people make under pressure. I let him talk. I let him reveal his anxieties. I tasted the fear in his words like iron on my tongue. He expected a scream. He expected tears. He expected a scene like in the movies. A broken woman, a shattered dinner table. He didn't expect me to be still. You should have told me, I said finally, and my voice was simple, unadorned. I told him I knew everything. He sounded like a man reading his last rites. He asked if I would forgive. I told him I would not forgive him, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because forgiveness lets the forgiver be small again. I don't want to be small, I said. It wasn't enough, and it wouldn't be, for either of us. I wanted him to lose not his life but his audience. I wanted him to feel naked of admiration. So I escalated in ways that couldn't be reduced to melodrama. I began to rewrite his narrative in others' minds. I leaked documents suggesting misuse of funds at his department. I approached a few journalists, carefully, with anonymous tips, and suggested there might be a story about favoritism in his office. I framed it not as scandalous but as the kind of ethical fog that reasonable people deserve to know about. The paper ran a small feature, and when a piece appears in print, it becomes real in people's hands. Daniel's smile thinned. At a board meeting, a client asked for clarification. His boss eyed him differently. Mara became an inconvenient footnote in articles about his supposed lapses of judgment. The edges he had relied upon, status, accomplishment, charm, began to dull. People who had once deferred to him nodded toward others, made new plans without consulting him. He was being eaten by inertia and suspicion. The more his life constricted, the more private his defenses became. He started drinking more. He stopped calling his mother regularly. He stormed through our apartment like a man trying to dislodge ghosts. I watched, sometimes from the doorway, sometimes across the bed. I learned the choreography of his guilt. It looked like agitation, then rage, then exhaustion. It made me realize that revenge is also about endurance. A person can withstand a single thunderclap of pain. They cannot withstand months of attrition. One night, he came home later than usual, smelling of cheap bourbon and disappointment. He fumbled in the dark and crawled into bed. He reached for me and I let him. In the privacy of our sheets, with his breath hot against my shoulder, I felt nothing but a curious detachment. He whispered apologies into the dim, words like soft stones. "I'll fix this," he promised, the old boast disguised as resolve. I felt an urge to show him the full ledger of damage. Mara's messages, the emails to clients, the anonymous packages, but I didn't. Instead I kissed the corner of his mouth and tasted the bitter of a man who wanted absolution without sacrifice. Then I acted. The last phase of my plan was not creative sabotage or rumor. It was out into the open, methodical, irreversible. I had acquired a few recordings. Moments when Daniel and Mara had spoken in a cafe with enough volume to be captured. A voice memo he'd left unsent that betrayed his indifference. I had receipts. A hotel booking for a weekend that overlapped a business trip he'd told me he took alone. I compiled these into a dossier that was boringly thorough. Dates, times, annotated messages. I had the help of a lawyer I had befriended months earlier under the pretense of needing advice about a small contractual dispute. She told me, in terms as clear and cold as surgery, how to compile evidence that could not be dismissed. She taught me the threshold for admissible proof and the way to frame the narrative so that what I had gathered looked not like a scorned woman's diary but a coherent pattern of betrayal. We filed for a separation. Not a dramatic, televised cut but a legal step that carried weight. I presented the dossier to his employer under the aegis of professional concerns. I showed it to his sister and his mother. I did not expose him in a way that invited violence or ruin beyond reason. I exposed him in a way that forced accountability. The goal was that the man who had believed his personal proximity sufficed as explanation would now confront the consequences of exposure. The law is an instrument that reframes gossip into consequence, and I used it without malice, but with the precision of someone who understood what it meant to be erased. Daniel's world unraveled in many small, sharp ways. He lost a promotion he had thought inevitable. A client withdrew. His sister distanced herself. Mara left town suddenly. The boutique announced she'd resigned for personal reasons. He was left with a thinning social capital, with loyalty that was conditional and brittle. There were times in those months when pity gnawed at me. I would watch him from across a restaurant, his profile like a photograph where the eyes were blurred. He hired a therapist and tried to explain what had happened as though it were a dream he had not fully controlled. People are resilient. His attempts to rebuild did not disgust me so much as bore me. There is a difference between cruelty and necessary action. What I did was chosen. It was also, I now know, an act of self-preservation. Then he tried to rebuild his life in ways I had not predicted. He started showing up at parks with stray dogs, donating to causes I believed in, saying the right things in front of the right people. He attempted, in other words, to perform repentance. The world, gullible and hungry for redemption, sometimes forgives. I warned myself not to let pity slide into softness. I had not sought to ruin him for spite alone. I wanted to be seen, acknowledged, restored in my own right. Forgiveness would have been an easy path to mutual forgetfulness. I preferred a different victory. Truth acknowledged and autonomy reclaimed. The final moment of the saga came not as a fireworks display but as a small, clinical victory. I sat across from him in a courtroom, calm and collected, while a judge signed a decree that unbound us. It was not the judge's signature that mattered. It was the fact that the separation was formalized, that the life we'd woven together had been officially documented as ending. The paper carried a weight. Daniel looked at me, and for a second something like real regret flickered in his eyes. It wasn't performative now. It was sharp and private and human. When we walked out of the courthouse, he tried one last time. "Lily," he said, grasping at my sleeve as if I were a life buoy. "Please. Let's talk. Just talk. We can salvage." The words were the same worn ones he had used in the apartment when cornered, but they sounded hollow now. I had already spent months building a new narrative for myself. Not the woman who waits for explanation, but the woman who decides. "I've already made my decision," I said. My voice was quiet and calm. The world around us whispered and moved. Indifferent. "You had your chance. We parted." It was not dramatic. No glass shattered, no curtains ripped. The most powerful scenes are often the ones where the ordinary becomes the theater. I went home, packed the last of my things into a box that smelled of cheap soap and old friendship, and left his apartment with nothing but the keys and the knowledge that I had reclaimed a piece of myself. Victory, in retrospect, is a complex thing. It was not the humiliation I had orchestrated, nor the tangible losses Daniel endured. It was the quiet reclamation of my identity, the way mornings no longer arrived with the weight of a shared name. It was the tenderness I gave myself in small gestures. Buying a book I'd always wanted, adopting a plant that thrived on neglect, learning to laugh without someone else's voice doubling mine. It was the way the world looked different when I stopped reflecting a man's image. People will ask why I didn't choose to forgive him privately, to be magnanimous and noble. They'll ask why I chose a path that felt, to many, like punitive architecture. The truth is simpler. I wanted to matter in my own terms. I wanted the person who had been so casual with my devotion to feel the cost of that carelessness. I wanted him to understand that love is not an entitlement. There was, too, an ugly human satisfaction in watching a man who had measured himself by external validation lose that scaffolding. But satisfaction is a fragile thing. After the dust settled, it was replaced by something quieter. Clarity. I had become someone who could plan and act, who could direct her rage into a language of consequences. I had also learned that vengeance is a cold medicine. It numbs but does not heal. The healing, I realized, would come later. Slowly, and not always along a straight line. Months later, I saw Daniel across the street from a cafe, thinner, his posture more protective, like a man who carries his mistakes as a physical weight. He glanced at me and then away, the look quick and unreadable. I felt no triumph then. Just a passing, odd compassion for a person who had once been the axis of my world. We are complicated creatures. We love and hurt and then continue. I moved to a new apartment with a skylight, and at night I would sit under the pale wash of stars and imagine the life I would build. This time, scaffold on my own terms. I dated, awkwardly and not so awkwardly, finding small joys in people who were not exhibitions of status but rounds of laughter. I worked harder, not to prove to Daniel that I could be better but to prove to myself that I could carry a life I had chosen. Sometimes I think about Mara and wonder what story she told herself about our entanglement. Perhaps she saw herself as a victim too, or as someone who had simply been in the right place at the right time. People are complicated. Context is a contamination of certainty. I do not seek to vilify her. My revenge was never truly against another woman. It was against the betrayal of intimacy and the complacency of a man who assumed the cost of his actions would be borne by someone else. There is a lesson in all of this that is not tidy. Power can be reclaimed, trust can be enforced, dignity can be demanded. But the shape of justice I carved was not the kind that unmade a person entirely. It was a restoration of balance, brutal and necessary. I learned that the self who survives infidelity need not be broken. She can be remade. People ask if I'm happy now. Happiness is a word that moves and shifts like light. Some days I'm luminous, feeling like a woman who has found a secret room inside her own heart. Other days the memory of what happened creeps back, a shadow at the edge of a photograph. But there is a steadiness now. I walk differently. I choose differently. I have reclaimed my name, Lily, and in it I have found a truth I would not trade for any old lover's apology. If my story teaches anything, let it be this. Vengeance can be a door to understanding, if you don't let it become a prison. I did not want to be defined by his infidelity. I wanted to be defined by the way I met it, with thought, with strategy, and, ultimately, with the courage to leave when the last signature was dry. The victory was not in inflicting pain but in regaining authorship of my life. When I close my hands now, sometimes they close on nothing but air. And it is, for the first time in a long while, enough. The quiet after isn't quiet. I thought the paperwork would be the cure. On a wet Tuesday in March, a judge severed our legal knot with a signature that looked like a cracked river. The pen lifted, and there was a sound. Stupid, bureaucratic, final. It was supposed to be the end. I walked out of the courthouse lighter, almost giddy with relief, like I'd put down a bag I'd been carrying for 100 miles and forgotten why it was on my shoulder in the first place. I moved into a small apartment with a skylight and a stubborn creaking window. I adopted a plant I named Finch because it leaned toward the sun with desperate optimism. I bought plates in a pale blue that had nothing to do with Daniel's taste. I slept diagonally. I ate in bed. I felt the kind of freedom that arrives like a thin, clear wind. For a while, nothing happened. The quiet settled. I learned the rituals of myself. I made tea the way I liked it, without performance. I began to speak softly to no one, the way people who are alone practice being gentle. Then something small. It was the mug. I keep my mugs on the second shelf, left to right. The chipped white one, the blue one with a hairline fracture, The mug with the hand-painted fox I bought at a street market because I liked the way it seemed to look up at me. I'm not precious, not obsessive. But one Tuesday, the fox mug sat on the right side where the blue one always waited, and the blue one was where the fox should be. It felt like a glitch in a dream. I told myself I must have done it absent-mindedly. I put them back. The next morning, the fox had migrated again. My keys disappeared for 3 hours and returned to the bowl by the door with the ring facing the wrong way. My windowsill plant leaned a little more than usual, like someone had touched its soil. I told myself, "You're fragile." Grief after victory is a specific ache. Victory takes scaffolding, and when you finally climb off, your muscles tremble. I forced a laugh. Paranoia is an ugly mirror, Lily, stop looking. Then the email. It came at 2:17 a.m., time-stamped and clinical, with a subject line only Daniel would write, clarification. No body text. Just a blank message, his name in the sender field like a bruise that had never fully faded. I didn't reply. I stared at the cursor in the empty compose box and felt the urge to put something there. Anything, even a period, as if punctuation could be a shield. I closed the laptop and placed it under a stack of books, like I could physically smother the reminder of him. An hour later, another email arrived. No subject. No text. An attachment, a photo of the skylight in my living room, taken from my street at dusk. Framed just so, the light from my apartment like a square of softness in the evening. Beautiful, if you didn't know what it meant. He was outside. Or he had been. Or he wanted me to believe that. I locked the door out of ritual rather than in panic. Fear is an animal you train. I made tea, hand steady, and carried the mug to the window. On the street, 2 cats fought in the alley. A man walked a dog in a red raincoat too small for it. The world looked ordinary. That somehow was the worst part. I checked the locks, checked the windows, checked the balcony door. Then I did it again. I slept with the lamp on and woke to the small humiliations of morning. A dry mouth, a tight throat, a pulse like a finger drumming on a door no one would open. I sent the photo to Elena, my lawyer. She called me back immediately, her voice brisk, no pity, which is what I needed. Document everything, she said. Do not respond. If he escalates, we escalate. But Lily, keep your mind clean. He will try to live in it. Restraining order? We can file, but we need a pattern. A judge wants sequence, not anecdotes. He's testing your perimeter. Don't let him learn it. I bought motion sensors the same afternoon. I bought a second lock and installed it myself with a drill and a stubbornness that tasted like metal. I bought a camera disguised as a smoke detector and another disguised as a book. Technology is an unromantic angel. I printed the emails and dated them. I put everything in a folder labeled simply D, which felt too dignified for what it contained. Nothing for a week. The quiet returned, now with a high frequency under it, like the air hummed. Then the smell of cigarettes in my hallway, stale and familiar. He'd never smoked in our apartment because I hated it, but he'd always stood in the hall, just outside the door, telling himself it was different. The smell means, I was here, and I know you'll notice. The next morning, my doormat, the small gray one with the woven edge, was turned around so the frayed corner pointed toward the door. Evidence, I told myself, is not feeling. Save what you can save. On Friday, I returned from work to find my balcony plant moved 6 inches to the left. Finch, inside, leaned harder toward the sun. On Saturday, I came home to the sound of my shower dripping. I hadn't used it since morning. I sat on the floor and breathed like it was a skill. I poured myself a neat vodka I hadn't touched since the court date and held it on my tongue without swallowing. It felt like a dare. When the knock came, I didn't startle. I knew before I opened the door, it wouldn't be Daniel. He doesn't knock when he wants to scare you. He sends a photo and lets you imagine the rest. I opened the door to a woman with salt and pepper hair and eyes that looked too tired for her face. She lived 2 floors down. I'd seen her with a toolbox and a dog that limped but couldn't remember her name. Hi, she said, and then, as if we'd been mid-conversation our whole lives, he's been sitting in a black car across the street. 3 nights this week. Doesn't get out, just watches. My mouth opened without sound. She watched me figure out what to say and spared me. I'm Ines, she said. I used to be a cop. Bad habit. I notice things. You should know I saw him. And you should know I took pictures. Not my first rodeo with men who think a street is a shield. She held up her phone like a badge. It showed grainy photos, street lamp tinted, of a car that looked like hunger, windows pulled tight. The shape of a man in the driver's seat, bent forward, lit by a screen. The timestamp at the top right. My skylight a square of white in the top of the frame. "Thank you," I said. It came out small, like it had to squeeze through a narrow place between language and fear. "You're not alone," Ines said, and I believed her in the practical way. Not sentiment, but logistics. "If you want, I can help you build a case. If you want more than that, I can help you build a plan." A plan for what? To make him stop. I thought of Elena's words. Sequence, not anecdotes. I thought of the mug, the keys, the plant, the photo, the smell. "I want him to stop," I said, and the last word felt like a blade I'd finally taken out of a drawer. We worked in the language Ines knew. Cameras. Angles. Logs. She brought over a small toolbox with a careful anonymity of habit. No logos, no brands. She installed a door alarm I couldn't see unless I squinted. She showed me how to check if a camera had been covered or turned. She taught me what security footage looks like when someone tries to move like a shadow. We set up a simple trap. A piece of hair taped to the edge of the door, invisible unless you knew to look. The hair was my mother's, rescued from an old hairbrush and kept for no good reason, which felt like the way the universe lets you preempt the future without telling you why. Ines made me move the fox mug every morning and night on purpose, to inoculate my brain against the thrill of noticing. "Make the weird normal," she said. "Don't give him the satisfaction of orchestrating your startle." I started keeping a running document on my laptop. Times, dates, noises, smells. Daniel had once told me my meticulousness was charming. I weaponized it. 3 days later, the camera by the balcony caught a body moving. Too slow to be a stranger, too steady to be a drunk. He came at 3:12 a.m., lifted the plant, set it down. He stood for a long while. He looked up at the skylight. In the black and white, his face was a smear of intention. Then he left. We took the footage to Elena. She watched it with a stillness I trusted. "It's enough to file," she said. "Not enough to win. But it will force the first move." We filed for a restraining order on a Thursday morning that smelled like a dentist's waiting room. The clerk stamped things with a bored violence. Ines stood in the hallway, a quiet presence. Elena's jacket was the exact sober blue of bureaucracy. I signed my name enough times to make it look like someone else's. Daniel, or his lawyer, would be notified. He would either contest it or he wouldn't. Either way, we had a record. Either way, he would be forced to do something other than slither. That night, no car. No email. No drip in the shower. I slept with the lamp off for the first time in weeks, and woke to the kind of fear that arrives because you slept. The next morning, I found a card under my door. No envelope. No name. A simple white rectangle with block letters in a font that tried too hard to be earnest. "You always wanted to be seen. Now you are." I felt something hot singe my throat. Not rage. Not fear. Recognition. He thought I had done all of it, the dossier, the exposure, the legal severing, because I craved an audience. He believed that because he had lived his life by mirrors, and I had broken one. I took a photo of the card, put it in the folder, and burned the paper in the sink with a small blue flame. The smoke alarm chirped once, then changed its mind. I went to work. I tried to let the morning be a morning. It was almost convincing. At 11:03 a.m., our internal communication channel pinged me. A message from IT. My login had been used at 3:18 a.m. from an IP address that wasn't mine. My stomach and the floor swapped places. I ran a scan. Files were modified. Not deleted, not ruined, just touched. The way the fox mug had moved. The way cedar hangs in the hall when there's been a stranger there an hour ago. Ines said, "He's testing infection vectors. Don't let him know it worked. Make him think you're not looking." Elena said, "We add cyber to the filing. We request expedited hearing. We stop asking him to behave and start making it so he can't." I said, "Okay," and felt the thing inside me that had hunted him the first time. The cold focus, wake up like a machine that had never really gone to sleep. The first true escalation came like a stage trick. Misdirection and spectacle. I had a presentation that Tuesday that mattered more than I wanted to admit. If I nailed it, it meant a contract, which meant freedom with a capital F, money that was mine without his name anywhere, the ability to move, to buy, to build. I had rehearsed it in my head while stirring pasta, while brushing my teeth, while watering Finch at the windowsill. 10 minutes before the presentation, the keynote filed on the shared drive glitched. Slides flickered. Colors warped. The graphs stuttered into nonsense. It looked like someone had taken tiny bites out of the data. It would have been almost funny if timing weren't an executioner. For a second, an old version of me rose, the me who would panic, stutter, patch, beg the universe for a better hour. The me that had apologized to Daniel for speaking too loudly when he was on a call. I let her rise, and then I set her down gently. "I see you," I told her in my head, and that was all. I plugged in the hard drive no one knew I had. I opened the clean copy with the dull confidence of redundancy. I presented like my life didn't depend on it. I watched the room shift from skeptical to interested to hungry. At the end, my boss's boss, Noor, who wore her hair like a crown she didn't need, smiled with the kind of approval that is better than applause. "Lily," she said, "we'll talk numbers this afternoon." On the way back to my desk, I passed a man in the hallway, shoulders tense. He wore a gray suit that tried to be expensive and a cologne I knew. He didn't look at me. He didn't have to. My skin knew him. Daniel had no reason to be in my building. He had found one. Security would later tell me he'd signed in as a consultant for a vendor whose name he'd pronounced with a confident wrongness. They'd given him a badge because men who look like him collect badges by existing. I turned around. I didn't run to him. I walked to the security desk and said, calmly, "There's a man in our building who's not supposed to be here. Here's a photo." I showed them the courthouse picture from the day of our hearing. I watched the guard's mouth turn down at the corners in practical unhappiness. He called a manager. I stood to the side and waited. Security found him by the elevators, badge hanging from his pocket like a fishhook. When they asked him to leave, he smiled the way I had once mistaken for charm. He said he was there to congratulate me. He said we were still friendly. He said a lot of things he thought would play in a lobby with cameras and men in shirts with radio earpieces. They walked him out. He looked over his shoulder once. It wasn't a glance for me. It was a glance for the building. An assessment of angles, of cameras, of where the blind spots live. Old habits flashed through him like lightning under skin. Noor appeared an hour later in my doorway like a woman who had already done 10 things that day, and still had time to ask about an 11th. "Is everything okay?" Her voice wasn't soft. It was precise. "My ex," I said. "He's been around. We're handling it. Do you want me to call legal?" she asked. That everyday sentence broke something inside me in a good way. Imagine a world where calling legal is boring, procedural, not an act of terror but of policy. I nodded. She did. Minutes later. She also told me, casually and with the authority of someone who could make things so, that I could work from home for a week. "Security knows his face now," she said. "That changes the math." I went home to Ines sitting on the stairs with her dog, a creature with a scar down one leg who looked at me like she had known me for years. Ines's phone buzzed. "You're popular," she said. "Camera across the street caught him leaving a second package by your door." Second. She pointed to the doormat. A small brown envelope with my name in block letters like typewriter teeth sat there like a dead thing. "Don't touch it," she said, and pulled on gloves from her pocket with practiced nonchalance. She opened the flap with a butter knife she seemed to carry for exactly this purpose. Inside, a flash drive, small and red, the kind you give out at conferences with logos on them. No markings. Cheap, which was somehow worse. "He wants you to plug it in," Ines said. "I won't." "I will," she said and laughed at my face. "Relax. Not here. On a quarantined machine I don't care about. In the courtyard. With a Faraday sleeve. Because I'm not an idiot." We did it. The drive contained a single folder, unimaginatively labeled, Lily. Inside, photos of me. Mundane, invasive, too intimate because of their ordinariness. Me stepping out of my building. Hair in a loose bun. Me buying raspberries I would forget to eat. Me at a bus stop adjusting a sleeve. Me falling asleep on my couch with a book across my chest. Taken through the window from the street. No notes. No threats. The threat was the existence of the folder. Ines uploaded everything to the shared drive Elena had set up for evidence, then removed the drive like it was a splinter. "We take it to the police," she said. "We make it boring for them to say no." Will they do anything? They'll take a report. If we're lucky, they'll take more than that. But the goal here isn't belief. It's accumulation. We make it hard to ignore. We did the police station the next morning like we were getting our teeth cleaned. Forms. A rookie officer with a baby mustache. A detective with a wedding ring she kept twisting. Ines did the talking for the first 5 minutes because she knows the language. She spoke in nouns they respect. Timestamps, footage, prior history, a pending order. Then I told the story in a sequence that sounded like it belonged to another person. The mug, the plant, the email, the card, the flash drive. I left out how my hands shook when I watched myself sleep on the tiny screen under the skylight. I left out how my body had become a door he knew how to open from the outside. The detective, whose badge said K. Rivera, nodded at all the right places. "We'll run the plates on the car," she said. "We'll add the digital harassment to the restraining order motion. If he violates, we'll have room to act. And if he doesn't violate? Then we build until he does," she said blunt. "I'm sorry. The law likes bruises it can photograph. We like patterns. Keep logging." Her honesty was medicine I hadn't known I needed. The world wasn't going to save me by proclamation. It would save me in increments. He escalated because men like Daniel believe fear is an instrument you can tune finer and finer until it plays exactly the note you want. He broke into my email, this time sloppier, or more confident, which is a cousin to sloppy. He sent a note to half my office from my address. "I have information and I'm willing to talk." No context. No detail. The kind of subject line that makes people look at you like you want to sell a story about aliens landing in your bathtub. I watched the replies come in like a weather map. Confusion, concern, one snide comment that made me feel both pierced and amused because at least he was honest about his dislike. Noor called me into her office and closed the door. She spoke in her practical voice. "Is this your ex?" "Yes." She took a breath that wasn't a sigh. It was a reset. "Then here's what we're going to do. We will issue a statement from IT that your account was compromised. We will remind everyone of our phishing policy and politely instruct them to stop embarrassing themselves. We will get you a new laptop. You will not apologize." That last part is important. I felt the almost cry rise, the kind that isn't sadness, but gratitude with nowhere to sit. "Thank you," I said, because it's sometimes the only sentence the moment will hold. She tilted her head. "He thinks embarrassment is a weapon. We will make it a shield." Elena filed an emergency request to accelerate the restraining order hearing. Detective Rivera added the email to the stack of evidence. Ines and I adjusted camera angles as if changing the furniture could change the future. He responded to our movement by shifting to the kind of threat that isn't illegal until it is. A letter to my landlord insinuating I had loud men over every night and that he suspected drug activity. An anonymous complaint to animal control about a dog in my apartment. I don't have a dog. A package addressed to my name containing a single gleaming set of keys that didn't fit any of my locks. I stopped jumping at shadows. I started anticipating them. I set my phone to record calls with a gentle ping. I moved to the back of my mind. I answered numbers I didn't recognize, because there's power in hearing a person attempt to disguise their voice. If he called, I wanted his voice printed somewhere beyond my skull. When the hearing date arrived, 10 days after we filed, the courtroom smelled like old wood and new paper. Daniel sat on the other side of the aisle in a suit that didn't quite fit anymore. He had lost a little weight, the kind that makes a jaw look sharper and a person look hungrier. He did not look at me. Elena presented a parade of small realities. The video of the balcony. The hallway camera. The flash drive photos. The emails. The incident at my office. The letter to my landlord. An explanation of escalation, written in a tone a judge would respect. Ines testified like she was listing tools in a box. No flourish, only detail. Detective Rivera spoke briefly and said the department had an open case number. Noor submitted a statement by affidavit. The judge, a woman with an expression like a librarian who knows all the secrets in the building, asked 3 precise questions. Daniel's lawyer tried charm. He called me emotional, without using the word. He said I had a history of vindictive behavior. He used dossier like a slur. He suggested this was a lover's quarrel dressed up in the clothes of the law. The judge issued a restraining order that afternoon. She made it specific. She named the distances. She named the places. She named the digital boundaries like they were locations you could visit. She warned him with an even kindness that made me like her more than I should have. He signed the paper with a hand that shook barely. He nodded at his lawyer like an actor who had finished a scene and wasn't sure if anyone had clapped. I went home and slept for an hour that felt like a small kind of dying. I woke up and watered Finch. I made a list of groceries I wouldn't buy. Normalcy is a muscle. We had the order. He had the order. I told myself it would hold. For 4 days it did. On the 5th night, the camera at the end of the hall caught the elevator doors opening. A figure stepped out with the particular confidence of someone who knows where all the cameras are and has decided to let them see him. He walked to my door. He knelt. He slid something under it. He did not try the handle. He did not linger. He looked up at the camera once, a glance that was not defiant so much as deliberate. When I picked up the paper, my hands were steady. The note was printed, not written, in a font that looked like polite signage telling you where the bathrooms were in a museum. It said, "Tell your friends to stop. You started a war you can't finish. I am not your villain. I am your mirror." I sat on the floor with my back against the door and laughed. I didn't mean to. It came out like a bark, harsh and surprised. A mirror. That was the story he had chosen for himself. He wasn't a man unraveling because he didn't like the word no. He was my reflection, an equal and opposite reaction, some twisted physics of intimacy. I had injured him, so he would balance the equation. "Fine," I said to the door, to the note, to the camera's small blank eye. "Let's balance it." The plan arrived sideways, while I was chopping garlic and watching a documentary about con artists. A woman described how she had set a trap using the simplest mechanism in the world. Curiosity. "People like him always step into the circle you draw," she said to the camera. "They think they drew it." I called Ines. "What would it take to make him show up somewhere he can't resist?" "Not much," she said. "Men like that have a taste for control and an allergy to being ignored. We make him think he's leading. We give him something he cannot not touch. We built a honeypot the way spies in movies pull a string across a doorway. We set up an email address that looked like it belonged to me but wasn't. We populated it with correspondence that looked real. Messages to a therapist, written by Elena, who could write clinically in her sleep. Notes about a meeting with Detective Rivera, which she actually had. A draft of a statement I would give to a reporter about workplace harassment, composed by Noor, who had a mean streak I admired when properly aimed. We salted it with details he wouldn't resist. Hints that I'd made a mistake in my evidence gathering, a reference to a key piece of video that might be inadmissible, and an invitation to a planning dinner at a specific restaurant on a specific night to coordinate next steps. We didn't send the invite. We left it sitting in the drafts, unsent. We then did the dumbest, smartest thing. We logged into that account on my home network for 5 minutes, once a day, and then forgot to log out. We put a flaw where he'd see it if he was looking. And he was always looking. 3 days later, the account logged an access from a new device. 2 hours after that, the draft invite to the planning dinner was gone from drafts and placed in sent, as if I had just mailed it to 3 people. Elena, Noor, and Ines. Their inboxes, of course, were clean. The message existed only in the sent folder, a breadcrumb he had moved to show me he could. We booked a table at the restaurant under a different name. We arrived separately, wearing ordinary clothes. Ines sat with her back to the wall like a former cop can't not do. Detective Rivera took a table near the door with a man I later learned was from cybercrimes, a phrase that had always sounded like a TV show until it sat beside me drinking tap water. Elena wore a cardigan that said schoolteacher and actually meant shark. I arrived last on purpose, like bait that knows it's bait and hopes the hook is sharp enough to matter. We waited. We ordered wine. We didn't talk about him. We talked about tomatoes because Ines had a plant on her balcony that kept giving fruit, and about Noor's niece who had just learned to snap, and about Elena's uninteresting coffee machine. The mundane is counterintelligence. He came late. He always loved an entrance. He walked in with a very particular walk of a man who believes the room is a mirror and he is finally seeing himself from the outside. He scanned, saw me, and smiled in a way that would have charmed someone who'd never had to scrape his residue off her ribs. He walked to the table like the restaurant belonged to him and put his hands on the back of the empty chair across from me. "Lily," he said. "We should talk." Elena lifted her head just enough for him to see her face. He flicked his eyes toward her, then toward Ines, who did not move but somehow looked sharper. He glanced toward the door and saw Detective Rivera looking down at her menu with exaggerated interest. He took his hands off the chair. There are moments where the tessellation of a person's choices is visible in their posture. He realized then, all at once, that he had walked into a room where the mirrors didn't show him what he wanted. He realized, too, that he could not make a scene without violating the order in a way that would be both obvious and instantly actionable. He realized he could leave, now, with dignity, and try a different battlefield. He took a half-step back. "Sit," I said softly, and the word had more gravity than I expected, like a coin landing on a table that's heavier than it looks. He sat. He sat because men like Daniel cannot resist a stage, even when the lighting is wrong. "Daniel," I said, and his name tasted like dust. "This is the last conversation we will ever have. After this, other people will talk. Not us." He looked amused, which is what he does when he feels afraid. "Other people," he said. "That's always been your way." I almost laughed. "You sent a flash drive containing surveillance photos of me sleeping to my front door, Daniel." He flicked his hand. "Dramatic." Ines, bless her, rolled her eyes in a way he couldn't quite see, but that made me want to hug her later. Elena opened her notebook with an audible sigh of paper. "Here are your options," I said, and heard myself, cool and unpleasant. "You stop. You disappear. You never email me, call me, stand on my street, drive on my block, talk to my boss, send a letter, send a package, touch a file with my name in it, or think it's smart to even mention me in a sentence I might someday hear about. You let the order be the rope that ties your hands behind your back until you learn to keep them at your sides." "And if I don't?" he asked, and there, finally, was the feral spark in his eyes I remembered, the one that lights up when he thinks he's found a rule he can pretend doesn't apply to him. "Then I go to the police with the evidence you're about to give me," I said, and slid my phone onto the table, screen up. It was recording. It was also, more importantly, streaming to a cloud folder whose link Detective Rivera had in her inbox, and to a tiny backup recorder under the table Ines had taped there before the waitress had even handed us menus. "And the detective over there stands up and ends your day with a ride." He smiled. "You think I'm going to confess in a restaurant?" "I think," I said, "that you're going to be yourself. You're going to try to frighten me because it's your favorite thing to do. And you're going to forget for a second that your favorite thing is exactly what the law calls a crime." He leaned back. He tapped the table in a rhythm I'd once found soothing. I watched him decide to say something he thought was clever. I watched him give me what I needed because men like him cannot help but narrate themselves when given a quiet. "You're not frightened," he said, eyes on mine. "You're performing fearlessness, which is cute. But you'll be frightened again. Because I'm patient. Because I know your angles. I know where you shop and when you fall asleep and which of your friends will answer a call from a nice, reasonable man who just wants to make sure you're okay. This order," he tapped the table, "is paper. Paper burns. You started a campaign. You hurt me. You made me small. You think I won't make you smaller?" He exhaled, satisfied, and that exhale, the sound of a man finishing a sentence he believes has proven his point, was the sound of a door closing behind him into a room he did not know how to lock. Detective Rivera stood up. She didn't hurry. She placed a hand professionally close to his shoulder, not touching. "Mr. Hale," she said softly, respectfully, so the room wouldn't startle. "You are in violation of a court order. Please stand." He laughed, which I knew he would, and then he said what I knew he would say, because men like Daniel think the words are talismans against consequence. "I didn't do anything. You just admitted intent to continue harassing and surveilling a protected person," she said, still soft. "You approached her within a prohibited distance. You sent electronic communications in violation of the order. You left items at her residence. You attempted unauthorized access to her accounts. And you entered a private office building where she works to approach her, which is documented by security. You did more than anything." He looked at me with a hatred so old it felt bored. "You're enjoying this," he said. "No," I said, and it surprised me how true it felt. "I'm ending it." The room had gone quiet. The waitress stood by the bar, eyebrows knitted. Someone at the far table pretended to find their soup interesting. I wanted, bizarrely, to apologize to the restaurant for turning it into a scene. But this is what happens when private violence meets the public. It looks like an inconvenience. Daniel didn't fight. He did the only thing that still offered him the illusion of control. He stood up slowly. He allowed the detective to move him toward the door like he was being escorted out of a club he'd rather not be in anyway. He kept his back straight. He made the dignity an armor. He walked past me without letting his eyes flinch. Men like Daniel believe they can keep the myth of themselves intact if they don't let their skin crack. On the sidewalk, the patrol car's lights reflected off the restaurant windows, red, blue, and the room exhaled. Ines touched my wrist under the table and squeezed once. Elena shut her notebook. The cybercrimes man, who had not said a word, finished his water. "Was that it?" I asked, and hated how small the question sounded. "For tonight," Detective Rivera said when she came back in, businesslike, as if she had just adjusted a picture on a wall. "He'll be booked for violating the order and for stalking. The DA will breathe down my neck about evidence, and I will breathe down theirs about patterns. It will be messy and boring and important. It will not be a movie. But it will be a beginning." I nodded. I expected to shake. I didn't. I felt the slow settling of a thing that had been rattled for so long that the stillness scared me more than the noise. I took a breath that tasted like garlic and relief. "I want to go home," I said. "Good," Ines said, and stood like the chair had been doing her a favor and she was done letting it. The arrest did not end it like a door slamming. It ended it like a page turning with the sound of paper and a hangnail catching the corner. He posted bail, of course. Money is the last friend men like Daniel lose. He pleaded not guilty with the performative indignation of someone who can't believe the rules have grown teeth. A court date set itself down on a calendar far enough away that it felt like a rumor. Elena said that was normal. Rivera said that was normal. Ines said normal is how they talk you into giving up. While we waited, Daniel tried once more to pull on the threads of my life like he could unravel me by persistence. But the room had changed. Security at my office scanned photos of his face like a prayer. My landlord, armed with Detective Rivera's card and a formal notice, stopped forwarding anonymous letters and started putting them in a manila folder marked evidence. My neighbors knew to call Ines if they saw a black car idling on our street. My boss's boss's boss, the kind of person who has people shield them from things, stopped by my desk one morning with a coffee and said, "My sister went through this. Take what you need." That sentence, said in a tone usually reserved for budgets and mergers, felt like someone had opened a window. I had turned my life into a network. Every time he tugged, the web tightened. Every time he slipped, it caught. The trial was short because the law prefers small bites it can chew. The DA presented the simple sequence of the violations, the footage, the emails, the recorded conversation in the restaurant. Daniel's lawyer tried to make me look like a director who had staged a play to entrap an innocent man. The judge, different this time, with the face of a retired boxer, didn't like that story. He liked the shape of the order and the shape of the violations. He liked the bland, unromantic facts. The verdict, guilty on stalking, guilty on violating a protective order, landed on a Thursday that smelled like rain. The sentence was not cinematic. Probation with conditions that were more than paper now, mandatory counseling, a suspended sentence that would unsuspend with a single mistake, community service that would put a broom in his hand, fines that would sting. A new, longer protective order with teeth. A warning from the judge said with a quiet that sounded like thunder. He looked at me once on his way out, in that small arrogant hope that he could make his eyes say something that would ruin me. My face did not offer him an audience. I did not give him the theater of my reaction. He walked past me like a man moving through a map he didn't know how to read anymore. After, outside the courthouse, Elena hugged me the way a person who does not hug warmly does when she has decided the rules can bend. Ines bought me a pretzel from a street cart and said, "Salt fixes most things." Detective Rivera shook my hand and squeezed once, a professional acknowledgement that we had done a thing people fail to do not because they can't, but because the world makes it easier not to. I went home and opened the windows. The air smelled like wet city, which is concrete and leaf and a metallic note you can't name. Finch tilted toward the opening like a boy craning his neck to see a parade. I touched the mug with the fox and left it where it was. I slept with the lamp off and woke to the kind of quiet that is not waiting for the next noise. You asked for an ending. I will give you a true one. Some weeks, I forget to think of him. This is a victory as sharp as any judge's signature. I go to work and say sentences about budgets and timelines. I buy raspberries and eat them before they go soft. I read on the couch and fall asleep and wake to the book on my chest and a neck that aches but in a generous way. I flirt with a woman at the coffee shop whose laughter is not a performance but an involuntary music, and we make plans that we are allowed to break because freedom looks like that too. Some nights, I still wake at 3:12 and listen for footsteps that do not come. I get up and walk the apartment like it's a new country I'm learning to pronounce. I don't turn on the light. The dark is not a villain. It's a place. I see Mara once in a grocery store, months later. She looks like a photograph smudged with a thumbprint. She sees me and looks down. I feel the urge to walk to her to say, "You were a symptom, not a cause." I don't. Compassion is a resource. I keep it for the people who fed me soup when I couldn't remember how to feed myself. Ines teaches me how to change a tire because one day I might need it. Elena invites me to a book club that is 80% wine and 20% arguing about sentences. Noor tells me a bad joke before every big meeting as ritual protection. Detective Rivera emails, once, a simple line. He complied with his check-ins this month. No incidents. The mundanity is a choir I did not know sang this kind of song. I don't forgive him. Forgiveness is a story people tell themselves to make sense of mess. I don't hate him either. Hate is a tether. I cut the rope and let the ends go. I do something more important than forgive or hate. I decide. I decide not to build myself around the worst thing someone did to me. I decide not to let fear be the architect of my house. I decide that vengeance was a bridge and not a home. I decide that justice, when it arrives, is not a lightning strike but a grid we lay down, line by patient line, until it holds weight. And on a morning like any other, I wake before my alarm to a gentle blue light at the skylight's edge. The room is ordinary, which is to say sacred. I lie there and feel my own breath like an animal sleeping in my chest that finally trusts the ground. I get up. I make tea. I reach for the Fox mug. I put it back exactly where I want it. This is the ending. Not the sound of a door slamming, not the red-blue of a patrol car reflected in glass, not the gavel or the paper or the handcuff click we pretend means something bigger than it does. The ending is me, in a room I pay for, in a life I chose, putting a mug on a shelf, and knowing, clearly, cleanly, that no one but me moved it.